So yeah, just thinking of all the big points we can bring home about COVID. But I'm so ready, and I feel like we're all so ready.
And we're live on Facebook.
I will admit everyone. Hello, everyone. We're just going to wait a few more minutes and then we will get started with our webinar. So just stay tight. Okay, wonderful. Welcome everyone to our webinar. Thank you so much for joining us today. We have already 136 participants in the Zoom call, and over 300 people have registered for the webinar around the world. So thank you so much for joining. We are also on Facebook. We are live streaming the webinar on Facebook on the International League of People Struggle US page. And again, this webinar is called What is Imperialism? The Deeper Pandemic and Its Cure. So to note, this webinar will also be recorded and sent out afterwards. Registration has been closed. So we will no longer be sending the Zoom information out. So yes, just note that, and please let folks know if they haven't registered to just watch on the Facebook live stream. So we're happy to have you here today, especially in light of the COVID-19 pandemic and Lenin's 150th year commemoration, whose birthday is in a few days actually, on April 22nd. This study on imperialism and a discussion on how to organize against it is really urgent and timely. So before we get started, we just wanted to cover some ground rules. If we could just change the slide, please. Great. So here are just some ground rules. Please add your organization and name on the Zoom. You can rename yourself on the side of the window. This will just help us as the webinar hosts see who's here and just streamline the process better. Also, all participants will be muted and can chat to everyone their questions. Andrew will be collecting questions throughout the webinar. Hi, Andrew. Andrew's waving. And so he will be doing that and collecting them for the Q&A session. Also, if any participants are harassing others or interrupting the webinar, they will be removed promptly. Please message our tech person, Bev. Hi, Bev. Bev is labeled as tech on the chat. If you encounter any problems, and they will remove the person in question. Great. So yes, so this is an ILPS webinar. What is the ILPS? So the International League of People Struggle is a global alliance that promotes, supports, and develops the anti-imperialist struggles of the peoples of the world. ILPS has 350 plus organizations from 40 countries on every continent except Antarctica. And it strives to realize the unity, cooperation, and coordination of anti-imperialist and democratic struggles around the world. So here in the US, we have a country chapter of the ILPS made up of 47 mass organizations with concentrations in the Northeast, the DC, Maryland, Virginia area, Midwest, California, Portland, and Seattle. So I'm just going to, before we go into the meat of the webinar, sorry, if you could just change the slide, please. Yeah, we just wanted to, again, reiterate this webinar is a study of imperialism as initially outlined by Lenin, which is a global political economic system in the highest stage of capitalism. After the main presentation of all the co-presenters, we will have time for a discussion and then go into presentations by featured speakers who will speak to the specific impacts of imperialism today, namely sanctions, occupation, and the struggle of frontline health workers. So we really hope to have a fruitful discussion and moving forward after all the speakers are done. Please input your questions and comments into the chat, and we will be sure to monitor those. So to present our co-presenters of our study, could you please go to the next slide? We have Steph York. Steph York is a clerical worker and trade unionist in Minneapolis, Minnesota. She is a member of Freedom Road Socialist Organization and serves on the Central Committee as a political secretary. Next slide, please. We also have Cody Urban, who is a member of People Organizing for Philippine Solidarity. He is a local coordinator with ILPS Portland, a member of the ILPS US Steering Committee, and a member of the International Coordinating Committee of the League, where he serves as financial auditor. And finally, our third co-presenter is Rafael Agosto Miranda, who is one of the co-chairs of New York Boricua Resistance, chapter of the Boricua Resistance National Alliance. BRNA is an alliance of organizations dedicated to education, organizing, and mobilizing the Puerto Rican diaspora for a liberated Puerto Rico. So I'll hand it off to our presenters to go right into our study.
Okay, thank you so much, Nina. This is a very timely webinar for all of us to be engaging in, especially with the current crisis that all of us are seeing with the COVID-19 pandemic, which of course, even though pandemics and viruses are, even though they're biologically a natural part of this world, their rapid evolution and spread and the specific ways that they impact people are clearly at the root of the current crisis of US imperialism today. So as Nina said, that we really take our theory of this from Lenin. Internationally, ILPS is engaged on a multi-month campaign called Lenin Lives to commemorate Lenin's 150th birthday. And one of the objectives of this campaign is really looking at the importance of applying revolutionary theory to revolutionary practice. And so what that means is that we're going to start this presentation by going through the 5 basic features, as well as the 4 inherent contradictions of imperialism that Lenin laid out in his historically validated theory. Next slide. And as we go into this next slide, I really want to focus on that last term, historically validated theory. So what this means is that when we say that ILPS is anti-imperialist, we don't say this just because it sounds good. We don't just say this because we think that that's the way we should move forward. We don't just have a basic, say that the world is imperialist and therefore we have to organize in a certain way. We say this because this theory that we lay out, that Lenin laid out, was one that was proved true by history. When Lenin, I'm going to drop a quick link in this chat because we don't have a lot of time to go through this whole, go deeply into the features. So I'm going to drop a few links for y'all to read after the slideshow. So the first one that we're going to go through, I'm going to drop, is the original reading called Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. And this was written by Lenin in the midst of World War I, which he described as an inter-imperialist war. And he laid out these 5 features that we're going to go through right now. And the reason that we say that this was historically validated is that when we look through these features, we see that they're still valid today. The way that the imperialist system is set up still follows true to these 5 features. The only thing that's different is that history changes the way that these manifest. So I'm going to quickly, it's been a little more than 100 years since this reading. So I'm going to quickly drop another link in here. And this is a book from Ebon International called Imperialism in the 21st Century. And this is a book that goes way more into detail about how these original 5 features of imperialism are still valid, but have changed a bit. Most notably, what we, in a lot of organizing now, we use the word neoliberalism. And when we say the word neoliberalism, this is not a new system different from imperialism. This is just the specific way that imperialism manifests today. I believe we could have maybe 10 different webinars just about neoliberalism. But if you really want to get more into it, I would definitely recommend reading this book here. These are free PDFs. So just to start, we're going to walk through these 5 features. And again, showing that, demonstrating that they're still valid for how we should view the global political economic system today that's at the root of the COVID crisis. And I think we should start from a basic understanding that US imperialism is the #1 enemy of the people today. So when we are talking about building an anti-imperialist united front, we need to see that this has to be directed at US imperialism. And I hope that going through these features and hearing from our featured speakers, we'll be able to demonstrate that further. So next slide. So the first stage that Lenin lays out is the process of monopoly capitalism. And that specific word monopoly is really important because it differs from different capitalist firms kind of freely competing, sort of what we were seeing in the later part of the 1800s with the emergence of capitalism into the world. So in that time, different capitalist firms and different industries had to compete in order to make profit, which meant accumulating capital. This was never, capitalism from its start was never on the side of the working class. But the way that it developed into monopoly capitalism was an even harsher attack on the working class, as different capitalist firms concentrated production. So therefore, oil companies like Rockefeller's, Standard Oil, didn't just own oil companies, they started owning transportation, buying off railroads in order to concentrate all lines of production. This meant that capital would start to flow towards his empire, his capitalist empire, and less firms began to take part of this collection of capital. This would mean that, and the important thing to remember is that each rise of monopolies would happen after a crisis. And this is specifically why I put we have some of these pictures here. So the first picture up above that looks like that web, we can't really see what's written on these, but if we were able to zoom a bit closer, what we'd see is that each of those big circles are some of the biggest pharmaceutical monopolies today. And all the little lines that are attached to them were all of the smaller pharmaceutical companies that got swallowed up by these big pharmaceutical companies just in the years between 2015 and 2018. Now we think of Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer. This is what we think of as big pharma. And so the reason that this is important today is because the big pharmaceutical companies are always looking to grow bigger and get more capital from a crisis. And this crisis of COVID-19 and why we're seeing such a privatized response to it is because of the fact that these monopolies want to grow from the crisis. Many of y'all may have noticed the two folks holding hands here. This is the Sattler family that developed OxyContin, and specifically said that money would be raining down on them because of how many people would become addicted to OxyContin. They literally engineered the opioid crisis so they could make money off of OxyContin. And we should expect no less from the privatized big monopoly pharmaceutical companies that are looking to make a bank off of a possible COVID vaccination. And finally, the main important part that will lead into the other factors is the political domination of the monopoly bourgeoisie. So many people might recognize these pictures here. This is, I don't remember what year this was, many changing faces over the months, but this at one point was Trump's cabinet. Almost every single member of Trump's cabinet and almost every single member of any president's cabinet, Democrat or Republican, over the last few decades has been a monopoly capitalist. They have owned monopoly companies, and therefore they are the ones calling the shots in the government. And that is going to be very important as we think about here in the next slides. So I'm going to pass it off to my comrade Steph to continue.
Thank you. The second feature of imperialism is the merging of banking and industrial capital. In the beginning of chapter 2 in Lenin's book on imperialism, he talks about the transformation of banks from intermediaries for making payments into monopolies, commanding almost the whole of money capital, as well as a large part of the means of production and raw materials. Finance capital then is derived from surplus capital, from surplus value. And to remind you, surplus value is the unpaid labor of working people extracted from them by capitalist production relations. Concentrated into the form of money and a myriad of financial instruments, financial capital in the hands of banks and hedge funds is a mechanism for investment and the creation of profit through exchange. The process of ascendant financial capital merging with industrial capital marked the end of competitive or laissez-faire capitalism and the birth of monopoly capitalism, i.e. imperialism. In the US, this process was personified, as my comrade said, by the rise of the Rockefellers and the Mellons. It's important to remember that the fundamental contradiction of capitalism is the contradiction between the social character of production on the one hand and the phenomenon of individual appropriation on the other. And this ascendancy of finance capital and the merger with industrial capital, along with the growing centralization and concentration of capital, increased this built-in anarchy of production, which sharpens the fundamental contradiction between the social character of production and the phenomenon of individual appropriation. The result is the potential for ever greater crisis of capitalism. And we saw that in the collapse of the banks during the 2008 crisis, and we'll likely see it again in the economic crisis that will follow this pandemic. One of the mechanisms of this merger is the importance of investments through stock sales. To quote Lenin, finance capital, concentrated in a few hands and exercising a virtual monopoly, exacts enormous and ever-increasing profits from the floating of companies, issue of stocks, state loans, etc., strengthens the domination of the financial oligarchy, and levies tribute upon the whole of society for the benefit of the monopolists, i.e. that political domination. Thus, banks and corporations are both awarded bailouts in times of crisis. The COVID-19 stimulus bill passed by the US Congress contained $500 billion in bailouts for corporations representing 0.01% of the population. In comparison, the 80% of people receive 30% of the bill. So yet again, under imperialism, those who already have the most, the 0.01% receive proportionally the most. A final note about finance capital is that the ownership of debt becomes a key source of power. The ownership of debt is in fact a form of investment utilized by the financial oligarchy of the imperialist powers to extract the wealth of entire countries. Even when the US, the ownership of debt becomes a means to transfer from cities, states, and even the federal government into the pockets of those who own the banks and the hedge funds. The imperialist countries then create so-called multilateral institutions like the IMF to enforce that debt and require quote unquote structural adjustment austerity regimes to privatize basic public services like healthcare and water, leaving the developing world, and frankly, even some weak imperialist countries like Italy, with medical systems completely unable to deal with the crush of the pandemic. Next slide. Now we move on to feature number 3. In early competitive capitalism, the export of goods is the typical feature. In imperialism, the export of capital becomes the typical feature. That's to say that the export of capital becomes predominant and primary over the export of commodities. Now, this doesn't mean that an imperialist power stops exporting commodities. For example, the US agricultural corporations have devastated Mexican agriculture for the past 20-some years. But the drive to export capital takes place in part, but the drive to export capital takes place in part because there is a surplus of capital that cannot be effectively used in the origin country. This drive to export is conditioned by a fundamental law of capitalism that there is an absolute tendency to seek the highest rate of profit, which is enforced by competition between corporations. The development of huge monopolies sharpens this competition and is a powerful driving force to growing capital exports. The export of capital allows the capitalists to do two things. It allows them to more easily exploit foreign labor and plunder raw materials, and 2, it allows them to more effectively and more cheaply saturate foreign markets. It's important to note here that by capital, we don't simply mean money. Capital itself is not simply or even really money. It's a social relation between people or peoples. Capital is, for example, control of the productive forces. This, as Lenin discusses, creates within semi-colonial and semi-feudal countries a capitalist class bound up with monopoly capitalism. There are capitalists in our own country and around the world who try to shield the brutality of capitalism by calling this developments. But even 100 years ago, Lenin said, if capitalism developed anything, it would not be called capitalism. For uneven development and wretched conditions of the masses are fundamental and inevitable conditions and premises of this mode of production. One of the mechanisms of imperialism is foreign direct investment, and we see from the chart on the slide showing that healthcare is the largest target of foreign direct investment in the oppressed nations right now. It should be noted that in monetary terms, most foreign direct investment is between imperialist countries, but that said, foreign direct investment can make up a much larger percentage of the economy and therefore have an outsized influence within the oppressed nations. Additionally, a lot of capital buildup in countries is through super exploitation and super profits extracted from within the country, and those are often much greater than actual capital flows. Early in this pandemic, the imperialist countries ran into their own problem with the export of capital rather than commodities. A couple of decades ago, the laws of imperialism determined that personal protective equipment could not be produced in the United States at a sufficient rate of profit, and the production of things like surgical masks was offshored. Trump was left to issue threats backed implicitly by US imperialist military force, demanding PPE and making explicit threats to Modi of India to export the drug hydroxychloroquine. All the while, workers producing these drugs and protective equipment are likely unable to get adequate supplies for themselves, leaving them unprotected. Meanwhile, in the imperialist countries, workers are made to go backward to a prior mode of production and rely upon handicrafts. Understanding imperialism is just as required for a concrete analysis of concrete conditions today as it was when Lenin prepared this manuscript. And while much more could be said, I hope my summary of these points is useful for today's discussion, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this topic 3 days before the 150th anniversary of Lenin's birth. And I'll pass that off to our next presenter, Rafi.
So hello, thank you all for having me. Fun fact, my birthday is the day after Lenin's birthday, so hey. The fourth characteristic is economic division of the world. And so in this, you see that transnational corporations compete to further monopolize other national economies. And you have the emergence of institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, and the World Trade Organization. And so an example of some of these transnational corporations that further monopolize is you have the example of the United Fruit Company, which was very big in Guatemala and in Latin America, which then becomes taken over by Chiquita International, which continues to grow and expand transnationally and kind of eat up all these other fruit companies. The IMF and the World Bank both come out of post-World War II period out of the need for reconstruction, right? And they basically grow to become what you can think of as some of the biggest and scariest global loan sharks, right? And so they lend money to a lot of developing nations, but with strings attached, right? And so in this, you see different austerity measures and adjustment packages tied to these loans. And so in 2019, this past summer, we saw in Ecuador, where the government had borrowed from the International Monetary Fund. And so the IMF then said, well, we need to impose austerity measures. We need to determine how you're going to use these funds and how you're going to actually restructure your debt and your budget in order to benefit us. And so what you see is that they wanted to cut and slash particularly fuel subsidies for the most oppressed peoples, and mostly this would affect a lot of indigenous peoples. And so people protested and were able to cancel, fortunately, a lot of those austerity packages. But Ecuador is not the only place where this occurs, but this occurs worldwide on a regular basis through the IMF. Another place that you can look at this is in Jamaica. There's a really good film called Life in Debt, which you can watch on YouTube, that really highlights how the IMF has done this to places like Jamaica. Additionally, you have between states to control the global economy. And so one of the ways that you see this taking place is through unequal trade agreements. And so if you look at something like the North American Free Trade Agreement, right? You have agriculture, US agriculture, big agriculture goes into Mexico. And because of the free tariffs, local economy is not able to survive, right? And so the US is able to continue to dominate in places like Mexico and also in Canada, even though NAFTA now has been canceled. What you see is that one of the things that Trump has said is that the US can actually benefit more through bilateral relations over these larger trade agreements, right? So he's looking at different ways that the US can still profit. Agreement, which was going to be the world's largest free trade agreement and would have included 40% of the global economy. And Trump pulled back from that, but is thinking about also entering back into that, right? So you really see this economic division through these larger institutions and the transnational corporations which take over. Next slide, please. So the next one is the political division of the world, which is states compete to control territory in open new markets, as well as sanctions prevent the development of national markets. Wars are deliberately launched on behalf of monopoly bourgeois, and monopoly weapon companies are the apex of US imperialism. And so what you see is that during World War II and World War I, you begin to see the division of the world take place in this political sphere. And not only are colonies for raw materials, but also for places to export capital and to defend the control of the imperialists through the setup of military bases. So an example of this would be the colonies that take place through the Treaty of Paris, which is you have Puerto Rico, the Philippines, Guam, and Cuba. And Puerto Rico is to this day a direct colony, but is converted into something called a Commonwealth in 1952, right? Which gives the people this illusion of a democracy, but actually is used to give tax breaks to the US corporations to go in and not have to pay any taxes, and to get access to cheap labor, and also to use it as a military base, right? To control access to Latin America. And you also see this similarly with Guam, which much of their land is currently occupied by the US military. And then you see this with the Philippines, right? Which was one of those colonies that was bought in the Treaty of Paris, but then is granted independence in 1946, but still is controlled by US hegemony to this day through unequal trade agreements and also unequal military agreements. An example of this is how the US still funds the armed forces of the Philippines, despite high human rights violations, right? But meanwhile, a place like Venezuela is attacked because of so-called human rights violations. And what we know is that that's actually because it's refused to allow itself to be dependent on the US and to cooperate. And so because of this, you see it blasted with sanctions, which you'll get a lot more on later, and these attempts at coups, right? And the same with Iran, where in 1951, Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh nationalized the oil industry and stood against foreign intervention in Iran. And so because of this, the CIA conspired with Britain to overthrow him. And then they installed a dictator monarch. And it had constant intervention from the US since, which has really destabilized the region. And anytime that Iran has not complied with US imperialism, it has been targeted, right? And so even to this day with the COVID crisis, because of the sanctions, Iran and Venezuela have been unable to get a lot of the support and help that they need because of the sanctions that are currently in place. Additionally, you see how the US continues to enforce its imperialism through federally funding most of the weapons manufacturers. So you have things like Lockheed Martin that receive a lot of federal funding from the United States. And you also see how sanctions have affected places like its colonies and semi-colonies. An example of this would be groups in Puerto Rico recently have requested that Cuba be given access, for the doctors to be given access into Puerto Rico to treat COVID patients, right? But because of its colonial status, it cannot open up the borders, and it would require US to be able to do so, but the US won't do so because it wants to continue to hold its political grasp. And so this just really highlights the hypocrisy of the imperialists and their actual interests, which are profit and control, and not the best interests of the people. And so just as strategic and relentless as they are, we must also be as strategic and relentless in our fight against them. And this is also why joining and strengthening the anti-imperialist alliance like ILPS is so important. So thank you again for having me. And you can pass that off to the next.
Great, thank you so much, Rafa. And to sort of finish off before we pass it off to our featured speakers, after we can grasp the 5 stages and how they relate to each other, we're left with these 4 contradictions that are inherent in the world system today under US imperialism. And this is reflected both within countries themselves and throughout the global system with this massive imbalance of power. And this is, of course, related to class struggle, which is another element of the Lenin Lives campaign, is to really push for the organizing of worker struggles in all of our campaigns. Because Lenin's theory of imperialism, the theory of anti-imperialism, takes into consideration these 4 contradictions. So the first one is between the monopoly bourgeoisie and the proletariat, the working class in each country. This is a major class, a primary class contradiction within each country that still exists today. And we can see that in the way that a monopoly bourgeoisie maintains its political power within governments. And so this reflects in the need to organize workers to unite against the political power of the bourgeoisie in each of their countries. And I do believe that it is still the duty of anyone who considers themselves a revolutionary to wage that struggle within each of their own countries. And that in itself is a contribution to the worldwide struggle against imperialism. And that goes into 2 of the other major contradictions, and that is between the imperialist nations and the semi-colonial and colonial nations, as well as between the imperialist nations and the nations asserting their national independence, like some of the ones that were mentioned before, like Cuba and Iran and Venezuela. And really making sure that there is a strong support, global support network against US imperialism that is trying to maintain its political domination of the world, so that these transnational corporations can continue to try to divide the world economically between themselves. And then really putting the focus still on the anti-colonial struggles of the global South is a major element that every worker struggle should be connected to. And then, of course, there's the inherent contradiction that will always exist between the imperialist powers themselves. There will never be a firm unity between the members of the monopoly bourgeoisie and the states that they have control over. There will always be cracks in the system through which may take advantage of, because they will always be competing to one-up each other. And that is what the people of the world can always rely on, is that while the imperialist powers themselves will only unite for long enough to try to one-up each other, our unity will always be stronger than them if we are all united in this anti-imperialist struggle. So this puts the importance on workers' struggles. It also puts the importance on all of the struggles of oppressed peoples for national liberation. When the webinar started, I saw someone ask a question: is the ILPS united in solidarity with the Watsayun struggle? And that's definitely a struggle that the ILPS has expressed unity for. Came out with a statement that's on our international website for the ICC. So I think that this really goes back to, when we sum up these 5 features and these 4 contradictions, That old saying of workers and oppressed peoples of all countries unite is still valid today. And it's why we need to really expand an anti-imperialist and anti-fascist united front amid this crisis of COVID. And so with that being said, we're going to pass it off to our featured speakers. I'll pass it back to Nina to introduce them so we can hear a bit more about how this historically validated theory plays out in different elements today, in different experiences today, amidst the COVID pandemic.
Great, thank you so much, Cody, Steph, and Raphael, for that concise and thorough explanation of the 5 basic aspects of imperialism and its contradictions. This is the reason why the ILPS even exists as a broad united front against imperialism. So it's a very key study to understand. We know that this was a lot of information in a short time. We will be having a question and answer session to better process what we just learned about the 5 features of imperialism. But first, we would like to present, like Cody said, our first featured speaker. She will present first due to some time constraints, and then the other 2 will go. But please continue to send your questions in the chat so Andrew can collect them. So now I'd like to introduce Nadia. Nadia is an organizer and educator based out of the Bay Area. She serves on the National Executive Board of the Palestinian Youth Movement, a grassroots movement of Palestinian and Arab youth who are taking an active role in our struggle for liberation of our homeland and people. She will be speaking on imperialism in the context of occupation and Palestine. So welcome, Nadia.
Hey y'all, thanks for the intro, Nina. Thank you to the previous presenters. I mean, it's a lot of information, but it's really, really important. And I think, yeah, I'm excited to present in this format and kind of contextualizing why the occupation of Palestine is part of a larger imperial structure and what internationalism for our struggle means in terms of resisting that. And so I'm going to actually share my screen and let me see. That might cause you, yes. Thank you so much. Please bear with me with the transition. Can y'all see my screen? Yes? Okay, great. And if I hit present, do y'all see like the big pop out? Yes? Okay, amazing. So yeah, I just want to say really shout out to y'all for hosting this and thank you so much for having me. I'm gonna do a quick review kind of what's happening right now in Palestine in the time of COVID-19. And what I'm gonna cover is particularly the prisoners movement, our labor movement, and also just the case of our access to hospitals and care, and go a little bit more into the infrastructure that Israel has set up for us within the 48 territories and within 67. When I say 48, what I mean is our territory that is now deemed as Israel. So if you look within a map, I call it 48 because those are the territories that were occupied by Israel in 48. When I say 67, I am talking about the West Bank and Gaza. And when I say, well, you'll see, when I say, for example, Zionist entity, I'm actually referring to Israel. Why am I referring to Israel that way? Because that is the political ideology that has been wed to Israeli nationalism and creates the modern state of Israel. And actually, as it was established in 1948, it is a Zionist state. So although most of us, I think, here on this call will have a pretty decent awareness of kind of where, the chronology of how Palestine was occupied, the reason I'm starting here really quickly with the British mandate in 1920 and 1948 is because I first want to talk about our prisons. So what a lot of folks don't know, if you were on the call last week with NSJP, you may have seen some of this information. But what a lot of folks don't know is that the British were actually the first folks to set up the prisons that Israel uses now in Palestine. And so the purpose of setting up these prisons in, around large Palestinian cities like Haifa, Jaffa, Ascalon, is not just to hold our folks who are struggling against European colonization and occupation. It was actually a double layer to use the prison like a fortress to actually look at and surveil the nearby Palestinian towns. Today, so if you look at like that little triangle by Jaffa called Petah Tikva, that's going to come up later. You can see that Israel uses this exact British infrastructure in order to continue the imprisonment of the Palestinian people. And another thing, just in 48, and in the timeline of 1948, when Palestinians are pushed out of our land and a very, very small percentage of us are left in Palestine or in the 48 territories in historic Palestine, what you have is the Zionist militias set up internment camps for us. In Jaffa, half of my family are from Jaffa. We were put into the internment camp of Al-Ajami. And there you have a lot of documentation if folks would like to continue their own personal research. The International Red Crescent and Red Cross Commission, they have resources and reports talking about these internment camps and the forced labor that took place between 1948 and 1950. And what we have after that for Palestinians living in 48 is military law. It's martial law, actually, where Palestinians are not able to leave their villages without permits. And this is all happening, I think, the important part when we think about Palestine today, all of this happened before the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, right? And so when you hear some folks say, okay, well, the situation in Palestine today is really, really bad, but before 67, Israel was, just kind of chilling in 48 and trying to find its identity. No. What I'm showing you all here is that Israel has been and always will be a settler colonial state, and its policies of control began much before it was actually established and was first practiced in the 48 territories. So going into the situation with our prisoners today, I just want to talk a little bit about administrative detention. Surprise, this was also originally introduced by British law to subdue Palestinians. But the important thing today is that from 1967, you have over 50,000 administrative detention orders. What is administrative detention? That means that a Palestinian is brought into the Israeli prison system. They might never see a trial. They have no knowledge, and neither does their lawyer, of why they are held inside the prison, because it's top secret information. They might never actually be branded with any particular type of crime. They are just held there indefinitely. And this administrative detention process for a Palestinian can be renewed every 6 months. So they might sit there for years without seeing a trial. Part of why our prisoners are on the front lines of our struggle is because one of the mass incarceration of our folks, and so it's a very popular tactic used by the Israeli state to oppress Palestinians. You have 1 in 3 Palestinians who have actually been held in Israeli prisons or are currently inside. And what we have as our response as part of our struggle is to make the prison a place of education, written production, and political theory. And so very much our prisons and the folks within them, our prisoners, are a living and active part of our struggle, and they are very much leading our struggle. And so I just wanted to put a picture here of the first Intifada. and you know, looking at popular resistance and why we don't leave our folks inside behind. Just to give you an idea of today in 2020, Israel is currently holding 5,000 Palestinians in its prisons, including 43 women and 180 children and over 700 patients. So those are people who have cancer, heart disease, and are otherwise ill. Several Palestinian detainees have come into contact with an Israeli interrogator who tested positive for COVID-19. The interrogator was working from Petah Tikva and Ofer. So remember how we had that map? This is same prisons. And this is how we think COVID-19 actually entered into the Palestinian detainee population. We currently don't have any updates of their health. So something I'm going to share at the end of this presentation is a petition from Adamir that I hope you all will sign, pressuring the Israeli prison system and the International Red Cross Red Crescent to release information of our prisoners about their well-being, and to also allow access of by, you know, prisoners' families and their lawyers to access them within the prisons. Basically, we have examples of Palestinian prisoners being recently released who, upon release, have been tested and actually are carrying COVID-19 and bringing that back to their families. This is the same thing that we're seeing in the labor movement, with Palestinian laborers coming back to their families and potentially infecting them. We actually had a death of a woman in Bitikta about maybe 2 weeks ago. Both of her sons are Palestinian laborers. She contracted COVID from them and she passed, unfortunately. At this point, Israel has removed doctors and nurses from the prisons, leaving only one nurse in every prison. Ayman Sharbati, who is serving a life sentence, actually set his cell on fire, and there were riots within the prisons. And at the same time, at the beginning of March, Israeli Prison Service removed over 140 products from the prisons, including cleaning supplies and products that can be used as disinfectant. So this is mirroring the exact time as COVID is on the rise outside of the prisons, and 4 prisoners came down with COVID from contact with an Israeli interrogator. This is on a regular basis what a labor checkpoint, or laborers within a Palestinian laborers within an Israeli checkpoint, this is what it looks like. So in terms of social distancing, you can see that that's not something that is possible. It's packed. So I share this really dramatic image with you, just to kind of show you the intensity of Palestinians crossing in the morning into Israel in order to work. Some of you might be asking, why in the heck would Palestinians work in Israel at all? Well, something that's really important to note is, while in Palestine, it's not just our land that's occupied, it's also our economic sector. So we don't have an independence since the Oslo Accords. We don't have economic independence from Israel. We rely on them. And whereas you have, at the beginning of March, around 70,000 Palestinian laborers from the West Bank being housed inside of 48, sleeping in temporary housing to reduce the amount of time that they take from crossing from their homes in the West Bank into 48, you know, Israeli news outlets were saying, well, this is wonderful because we know that, you know, most Palestinians who, I think it's about 45% of Palestinians who are of the working age, so below 35, most of them have not had the opportunity to work because our labor sector inside of Palestine itself is so depleted. There isn't access. So they'll say, well, this is great. Palestinian laborers in Israel make up over 20% of the agricultural sector, and they make up over 40% of the building structure, right? And what we know is that actually this is a really dangerous practice where, instead of asking the question to Palestinians, why are you working in the Israeli sector? And them responding, well, I either can choose between starving my family or getting sick, right? What what we're actually looking at is also the non-documentation and the non-protection of Palestinian laborers. So we have over 100,000 Palestinians who are working within Israel. These numbers are really hard, y'all, to get a good grasp on, because the unions that are actually documenting these numbers are Israeli unions. So they're only documenting Palestinians who have work permits, which is about 60 to 70,000. So these other numbers, we're not sure. And if you were to ask me what percentage of Palestinian labor contributes to Israel's GDP, I actually couldn't tell you. And so the important point of this is that last week, about 15 Palestinian laborers who were in the industrial zone were diagnosed with COVID. The other really concerning practice that we have is, so Israeli employers are testing Palestinian workers for COVID when they show signs. But before, we have a couple of examples. Before Palestinian workers are actually diagnosed with COVID, they're dumped on the side of the road by the Beit Sira checkpoint and expected to walk through the checkpoint back to the West Bank. And so we have a couple of cases. I just wanted to leave this here and just talk about one of the cases of Ibrahim Abu Safiya, who was literally dumped on the road and left to die. And this is, if you look at the video footage from the Beit Sira checkpoint, you'll see a couple of Israeli vans dumping, literally pushing workers out on the side of the road. So this is really kind of the situation that we're seeing today in Palestine. And basically, one of the last points before I just quickly go into kind of the infrastructure of hospitals, basically in the difference maybe between curfews and this current state of global quarantine is that in a military imposed lockdown like Palestine, remaining in your home doesn't necessarily mean that you're safe, right? And what we have on the right-hand side is actually one of 35 clinics that Palestinians can access in Area C in order to gain treatment or tests for COVID, and it was destroyed by the Israeli military. We also have an increase, almost double the amount of house demolitions in the month of February and March by Israel as in January or previous months. So we actually see like a state policy of increasing the homelessness or home insecurity for Palestinians. Oh, wait. Well, that's the end one. Let's see where the slide is. Okay. I don't know where the slide is for the beds, but I can, sorry, y'all. Let me go back to it. But basically, can y'all still see me? Yes. Okay, wonderful. But basically, just to give you an example of kind of some of the things that we can expect in terms of hospital beds is, I'm not sure where my slides went. But anyways, I know most of them off the top of my head. Basically, the current situation on the ground in terms of hospital beds is that we have only 40 ICU beds for 2 million people under siege in Gaza. And there are currently 1,000 people per bed in the Gaza Strip. We have about 750 people per bed in the West Bank. And as I mentioned, there are 330,000 Palestinians living in Area C who are serviced by, 15 mobile clinics. That mobile clinic that I showed you in the previous slide was actually one that was built with Dutch money as a additional one that was destroyed recently. And then just inside of 48 quickly, so for Palestinians who stayed, who now have Israeli citizenship, there is not a single governmental hospital in any of the Palestinian cities. Those who are residing normally within their areas don't have access to COVID tests. It's really, really difficult to actually access reliable information about the spread of the virus. And then on top of that, you have an Israeli government plan to build drive-in testing stations that provide resources. They are going to be set up in 7 Jewish cities, but not one Palestinian community. And you have 45 clinics in Jewish cities that are set up for primary coronavirus response. You have 0 in Palestinian cities. The reason I am giving these numbers is just to show you the stark institutional differences, right? And so if you were to look today, I think, at cases of coronavirus in Palestinian areas, particularly in Bethlehem, which had a lot of international tourism, Tulkarem, which is one of the main vectors for Palestinian laborers, and then also Palestinian cities in the north who are relying on Israeli infrastructure but don't have the same access to services. You would see a really high percentage of COVID patients within that population. And so one of the things that I wanted to offer to y'all is a point of action. And I'm actually going to put the link in the chat. This is particularly petitioning the Israeli prison service again to allow prisoners access to their lawyers and their families. Our major demand is to free all of our prisoners, but primarily at this time, we want mechanisms to basically allow those who are most at risk out from the prisons. And the biggest, one of the biggest problems right now is that we don't know the status of our folks in prison, because the only org who's allowed, or any body who's allowed to access our folks inside, is the ICRC. And at present, they are not reporting the well-being of our folks inside. And someone said, Rissa, if that's correct pronunciation of your name, it sounds like Israel's weaponizing the COVID-19 pandemic. Absolutely. I would say that that's one of the conclusions of this. We have every reason to make that conclusion. And in terms of, something that this brings to my mind, we also have every reason to believe that Israel is intentionally leaving, Israeli prisoners who are going back to their families with the COVID virus so that they can pass it on to their families. Palestinian laborers are not being tested, and they are going back to their families when they are leaving 48. There's a lot of evidence for that, absolutely. I think I'm going to end there. I hope that what I presented was clear. I am aware it's a lot of information. And so I hope this was a valuable presentation, just to kind of give some entry points into what's happening right now in Palestine, what's exacerbated by COVID-19.
Thank you so much, Nadia. That was a really thorough presentation and very timely, since Palestinian Political Prisoners Day was just on the 17th. So now we're just going to go into a quick Q&A session. So questions for our 3 co-presenters as well as Nadia on the 5 basic features of imperialism, as well as the presentation on Palestine. And so Andrew will be walking us through this process. So thank you, Andrew.
So the first question is from Mark, and I think it's an excellent question. How do we articulate our support for global South states that may not perfectly represent the interests of the national proletariat, but at the same time are the only and best entities preventing complete colonial subordination to the United States empire? This seems to be a frequent contradiction that liberal apologists for empire try to exploit. There's an idea for Rafa to answer, but I think any of the panelists can answer it. And I will copy the question into the chat again, just so people can see it.
Sure. So I'm actually going to go back to one of Cody's slides, because I think it's important that we review the contradictions of imperialism? I think it's a really great question, and one that is important to address. Can everybody see my screen? Cool. So a lot of times people say things like, well, you know, this country is not, you know, doing what needs to be done, and, you know, there are uprisings happening in these countries and such and such. And that may be true, right? And so I think we need to understand that there are the four contradictions of imperialism. So there are going to be contradictions, right, within those nations, between the bourgeoisie or the state and the proletariat within each country, right? And we need to understand what are the causes of those contradictions, right? And so I think one of the things is we also have to understand that there's also this contradiction between the imperialist nation and the nations asserting their national independence, right? And so what we can understand is that there are other imperialist nations, but right now, US imperialism is the largest imperialist country and the largest imperialist power, right? And so we need to really unite and direct a lot of attention in stopping and cutting down US imperialism. And so for other countries, let's take, for example, Venezuela, Cuba, North Korea, Iran. For these countries to take a stand against US imperialism or US intervention within them, that is something that we should support, right? We should support the fact that a country is saying that they do not want US imperialism within their country, right? They don't want US intervention within their country, and that should be supported. But at the same point, those governments may not be doing the best for the national proletariat within their country, right? And so we can simultaneously say we support that a nation does not want US intervention within them, and we simultaneously support the proletariat of that country and the people's groups on the ground that may be saying, you know, this government is not acting within our interests. And you can support both, right? One does not cancel out the other. I think that it's important to understand that we support a country that stands against the intervention, right? Because the US intervening is never for the benefit of the people, and it's never for the benefit of the proletariat. And we know that, right? If we think about it, what I used before when I talked about the Philippines, right? We know that the Philippines has human rights violations that are occurring at the hands of the armed forces of the Philippines. However, the U.S. continues to fund the armed forces of the Philippines despite these human rights violations, right? But why is it funding that? Because the armed forces of the Philippines is acting within the interest of U.S. imperialism. Meanwhile, you may take something like Venezuela, where maybe not everything is perfect within Venezuela, right? But at the same point, Venezuela is not agreeing or supporting US intervention within it. And so because of that, the US wants to install coups, it wants to destabilize, it wants to create all of these things. But you know, why is it attacking Venezuela? It's not because of human rights violations in Venezuela. It's because Venezuela refuses to cooperate with US imperialism within its borders. And so I think we really need to understand those different things, that US intervention and US so-called aid and US entering into any sort of country with the guise of human rights is never because of human rights. And we need to understand that. And we can simultaneously support people's groups, people's organizations on the ground that are saying this government is still not acting in my interest, despite the fact that we may support its stance against US imperialism. I hope that answers the question and makes sense.
I would just like to amplify what Rafa had to say. I think that we need to understand who the main enemy is and where we have to strike the main blow, and sometimes that means understanding what's primary means not buying in to the contradictions that the other contradictions that exist within the situation. But I think I really unite with what you said about how important it is to recognize that that fourth contradiction and to support even imperfect countries that are striving for independence from U.S. imperialism, because U.S. imperialism is our main enemy.
So unless panelists have anything else to say on this question, I'd like to introduce the second question. And for this Q&A session, I'll make this the last question just to keep the program moving. This one's from Nia in Boston. What can we do as allies from the US to help the people in Palestine, even beyond the pandemic? And to clarify, there's a lot of parallels with the institutionalization of Black people in prisons here in the US. And I want to know what applicable frameworks can be used to help Palestinians reach their freedoms and close those prisons. Again, I will paste that.
Thanks, Andrew, for finding that in the notes. Yeah, so the first part of the question, actually, I'm going to take the second part first. So asking kind of what are the applicable frameworks that we can utilize to better understand or maybe see a crack in the carceral system of Israel's carceral system of Palestinians. I think what our prisoners inside are saying is a united frame of the popular movement, Palestinian popular movement, which is we want nothing short of liberation and return. So liberation means not just the dismantling of the Israeli prisons, but actually the dismantling of the Israeli control and the Israeli state, which supports those prisons. And so when we talk about return, we also have to, I think, note, it's a really good question, Nia. I think just to contextualize it, we have to note that Palestinians inside of prisons are not the only ones who are isolated from their loved ones outside. Even outside of those prisons, Palestinians are isolated from each other. And that is an explicit aim of the Israeli occupation. And it has been since 48, when you see the disparateness of Palestinian communities and the dispossession of our people into refugee camps and then into further exile into where we are in the United States, for example. And so a demand that we have is full return of all of our people, all 13 million of us, to be able to be back in Palestine, to be able to have access to actually building our own future, our own self-determination. And that means the fall of the settler colonial regime, which is the Israeli state. And so I think for all of us, for folks who are living in the United States, or folks who at least have some relationship here, it's really important for us to challenge the support that the United States gives to Israel in terms of military aid, which is the highest in the world. You have 3.8 billion yearly. And I think we need to be also arguing not just against that military aid, but where should that money be redistributed to our communities? It's a challenge, right? Because I don't have, as a personal approach, I don't have much faith in the US government institutions. I don't. But what's important is I do have faith in us and being able to form a popular movement. And I think curbing the isolation of Palestinians in Palestine and curbing the isolation of our movement as something that's strange or anti-Semitic, which it's not. When we're arguing for Palestinian liberation, there is not a note that we are anti-Jewish. There are many Jewish allies who stand with us and are against supremacy. Right? That's the foremost point. We're fighting for a just world. So in working together and trying to build an international struggle from Palestine, and actually with folks in the diaspora, and calling for justice back home and using our positionality here in the United States to do that, I think that is the focus. When we talk about taking away some of the tools or the money that Israel utilizes in order to oppress us, which is here held largely in the United States, to me, that is a tool of breaking down the larger structure of oppression. That is not the because. The because is us building a larger movement. And so I think, yeah, when we talk about the framework of freeing our folks from prison, we have to connect that back to land liberation and the creation of a political possibility for our folks. I hope that answered the question. It's a hard one because it really takes our ideas and we have to create a strategy for how to actually append those ideas into practice. And we know that these powers that we're up against are no joke. It's a really tough struggle ahead of us, but we are making a lot of leeway, and I know we are. And I think my comrades here on the call have also, we all have seen ways in which we can break the imperialism apart by also understanding where its power lies.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you everyone. Thank you Steph, Raphael, Cody, and Nadia for those answers. Please everyone also maximize the chat to continue asking questions, and if the speakers can even type out answers as we go along, we will have another Q&A towards the end. So now that we have done the first portion of the study, as well as Nadia's part, we will now be going into the rest of our featured speakers to discuss specific case studies of how imperialism affects people today. So our next speaker is Joo-hyun Park. They are a writer of the Korean diaspora and a member of Nodatol for Korean Community Development. They live on Lenape lands called Brooklyn. Joo-hyun will overview imperialism and sanctions, specifically on how they affect Korea.
Okay, thank you so much everyone for joining us today. My name is Joo-hyun. I'm going to be sharing my screen with you. I have a little presentation to talk about sanctions. Just give me 1 second. Okay, there we go. And I'm going to present, and everyone's still here? All right, awesome. So today I'm going to be talking a bit about sanctions, specifically giving an overview of what they are, how they work, why they matter, and talking a little bit about the specific impacts they're having on the DPRK, otherwise known as North Korea, although that's certainly not the only thing we're going to be covering today. So starting with the most basic element, what are sanctions? Sanctions are any economic or financial penalty that one country can take against an individual, an organization, or another country. So that can be against a particular person, usually a member of government or a member of the ruling elite. It can be an organization or an institution, which can be a state institution or something like a company or a bank, or it can be another country altogether. Sanctions that are created by the US are implemented through a variety of bodies. They can be passed as laws in Congress. This has been increasingly rare since the War on Terror, although it does still happen. Most of the sanctions that are in effect today are actually executive orders signed by the US president. In some cases, US sanctions end up being implemented through the UN Security Council. The US has a veto vote and permanent role on the UN Security Council, and because of that, they're able to exercise broad influence over its agenda. Last but not least, there are various departments and agencies within the executive branch of the federal government, the Department of Treasury, Department of State, the list goes on and on, which create a variety of different sanctions or enforced sanctions, and this is entirely conducted through more or less bureaucrats. This is a partial map of countries that are under US sanctions. I say partial because unfortunately a good chunk of the world is cut out from it, but this is a good resource I could find to sort of give an overview. There are 39 countries in total around the world that are subject to some form of US sanctions. All in all, this adds up to 2 billion people, or about a third of the world's population. And this resource is from the coalition called Sanctions Kill. You can visit their website at sanctionskill.org to learn more about their work and what they do. They have lots of resources to help people understand more about sanctions, and also that organizers can use to educate others. So getting a bit into the impact of sanctions, it's important for us to understand that there are different variables at play. Sanctions are always a very cruel and coercive implement used by the US government. However, the precise impact that they have on local populations varies. One of the main factors is the scale of the sanctions. As I mentioned earlier, sanctions can be against an individual, an organization, or a country, right? So there are some countries that are technically under US sanctions. However, what we mean by that is that there are particular individuals in that country or particular institutions that have been sanctioned, not the entire country itself. An example of this is Botswana, where several members of the government are currently under sanction. And, you know, like while Botswana is dealing with many, many different civil problems, many different issues caused by imperialism, the particular effect that sanctions is having is limited in comparison to some other cases in that one instance. On the other end of the spectrum, we have countries that are explicitly or practically under total embargoes. This means that either the US says you cannot conduct any sort of trade whatsoever with this country, or they are effectively saying that by basically banning all of the major sectors or all of the major institutions in that country. Four strong examples of this are Cuba, the DPRK, Venezuela, and Iran. Another thing to consider is local economic factors. And I would really highlight two things here. One is the dependence on trade and sort of the economic resiliency of a particular country and its self-sufficiency. Cuba is a good example of a country that is under a total embargo, and while that embargo has really devastating and severe effects on everyday Cuban life, Cuba has also been able to, because they've been under the embargo so long, develop their own medical industry, produce 100% of their own agriculture. So the current effect of sanctions on a place like Cuba is a little bit different in comparison to some other countries that maybe don't have the same level of agricultural self-sufficiency or other ways of being able to care for and provide for their population. Another consideration is the strength of a particular country's independent foreign relations and the power it's able to exert on the world stage on its own. A good comparison point here is Iran and Russia. Iran and Russia are both affected by sanctions that affect their oil sectors to varying degrees. The impact in Iran is different than in Russia for many reasons, but one of them is because Russia is able to, has different kinds of relationships around the world with different countries and is therefore able to conduct trade in a more independent fashion than Iran can. There is also a slight difference in the degree, or not a slight, I would say a pretty significant difference in this degree of sanctions that's been placed on these two countries. But part of the reason why there's a differential or different impact is because of the relative standing of both of these countries in relation to other nations in world politics. Now, when we get into the impact of sanctions and how it affects people on the ground, we need to understand that there are economic impacts that are combining and snowballing with health impacts to create some really devastating effects on people's life chances or their exposure to premature death and illness. On the economic end, sanctions disrupt trade. They usually, in more severe cases, they usually cut off countries' access to international capital. That means that they can't take out loans, they can't get investment for various projects. In some cases, like with Iran, they're unable to even use their own currency in international transactions. This obviously has severe effects on economies, creates recessions. It also leads to shortages in commodities. There's a lot of right-wing propaganda, which has highlighted shortages in places like Venezuela or Iran as proof of the greatness of the American capitalist system. But what that propaganda usually doesn't cover is that those shortages of commodities are being caused by sanctions and their economic impact. Now, when I say shortages of commodities, I don't just mean like luxury items. I mean everyday things that people very desperately need, whether that be medical supplies, things like food and clothing, or just things that are really essential for the infrastructure of a smoothly operating society, like water filtration equipment, agricultural equipment, etc. Obviously, with all these economic impacts, there's usually sharp rises in unemployment, followed by rises in absolute poverty. And what this means is that people are less able to fend for themselves and less able to care for their own health. In the health sector as well, food insecurity caused by shortages in commodities and capital also compounds the effects of sanctions on local peoples. There are often medical sanctions. This is especially the case in Iran, the DPRK, and Venezuela, where the lack of access to basic commodities and also to capital means that medical systems in these countries have been struggling for some time to source life-saving medicines and basic equipment that they need to do their jobs. And this is especially devastating in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly in Iran and Venezuela. The cumulative impact of sanctions on the economy and on the medical sector also means that the state's capacity to respond to medical and health crisis is diminished because they're also dealing with less capital. They're also dealing with all of the social problems that are created by sanctions' effect on the economy. What all of this translates to is reductions in life chances and higher exposure to premature death. And in Venezuela, for instance, we can look between 2017 and 2018 when a fresh round of sanctions, particularly targeting the oil industry, were implemented by the Trump administration. There was a rise in mortality by 40,000 people. So usually how this is interpreted is that the effects of sanctions cumulatively on the society led to 40,000 extra deaths in a given year. In the case of the DPRK, one study which particularly looked at the effect of sanctions on UN aid programs, which many people in the DPRK depend on for their survival, found that shortages and delays in these programs led to the deaths of 3,968 people in that 1 year, 2018. In the past month or two, as Iran has been grappling with COVID, more than 5,000 people have already died. A lot of this, while we can say that there would have been a certain number of deaths from COVID in any case, the way in which sanctions has really impacted the medical system in Iran is also something that particularly needs to be highlighted, especially given how the U.S. implemented even more sanctions after the news already came out that there was an outbreak that was spreading, and also has continuously resisted calls both internationally and domestically to rescind or temporarily end sanctions against Iran for the duration of the pandemic. These are three very current cases. Looking at some more historic examples, Zimbabwe, which is still under US sanctions, which began, I think, in 2002 or 2003. After those sanctions were first implemented, there were really severe impacts on Zimbabwe's HIV and malaria programs, which really reduced the ability of Zimbabwe to be able to fight back against these diseases and treat patients. This led to the unnecessary exposure of many people to these diseases. While Zimbabwe has received some loan money since then, I believe about 5 years ago, to address these issues that were caused by sanctions, they're still in many ways reeling from the impacts of this. In Iraq during the 90s, at least 200,000 children were killed by US sanctions that were levied against Saddam Hussein. And in Haiti during the late 80s and early 90s, one study found that there were an additional 1,000 child deaths in Haiti a month during the duration of US sanctions. So this is kind of giving an overall picture of how sanctions affect the society and lead to increased death, which is really a very long-winded way of saying sanctions kill. Moving us on a bit, I want to take a second to look at the particular impact that the new generation of sanctions has had on the DPRK. The DPRK has been under US sanctions for a very long time, essentially since 1950. In 2016, a fresh generation of sanctions were implemented under the Obama administration. And these sanctions differed from sanctions of the past in that they explicitly targeted various sectors of the North Korean economy for total export bans. And what I mean is that they basically looked at the 3 or 4 top sectors of the North Korean economy, because the North Korean economy doesn't have too many different sectors that it's drawing from, and basically cut off the ability of North Korea to conduct trade for those particular areas, in effect shutting down the entire economy. So if we look at the arc of North Korean exports and total volumes of trade from 2014 right here to 2018, we can see that there's a really precipitous drop that's especially accelerated after 2016. And this is just to illustrate what kind of effect these sanctions have at an economic level. Looking here, this is from a resource from the OEC, which shows the total breakdown of exports conducted by North Korea in 2017. As we, just to simplify this, on the left, we have the largest sector, which is minerals and ores and metals. To the right of that, we have textiles, which is the second largest sector. And then the third column is the third largest sector, which is agriculture. All 3 of these sectors, agriculture and food products, textiles and metal ores and minerals, were effectively banned from any sort of export. So this is in one fell swoop, 80 to 90% of North Korean exports no longer being allowed to be accepted by any country. And as you can imagine, this has had a really devastating effect on North Korea's ability to access capital, on people's ability to sustain themselves and their livelihoods, etc. This is kind of to give us a limited picture of the particular effect that sanctions against the DPRK have had. This is from the organization Korea Peace Now, which conducted a study of the effect of sanctions on UN aid programs in 2018. What they found is that a total of 3,968 counted, there were a total of 3,968 counted deaths in that 1 year alone, specifically of people who died because something that they needed from a UN health and aid program was either not able to reach them in time or was not able to be sourced. And what they found was that 80% of these deaths were children under 5, and that there was a disproportionate impact as well on pregnant women because UN sanctions effectively ban the import of all medical supplies because there is a blanket ban on any item containing metal. To dig in a little bit deeper, sorry that someone is texting me. I don't know if you can see that. To dig in a little bit deeper, this is a partial list of various things that are banned by sanctions against the DPRK. As I mentioned before, any item with metal cannot enter the DPRK through trade. So that means everything from everyday items like nails, screws, spoons, like basically like anything you can think of under the sun, it's not allowed. But what this also means is that, most medical equipment is effectively banned, right? So that's things like that are everyday, from things like stethoscopes to more specialized equipment like ultrasounds and catheters, to really life-saving necessary equipment like things like ventilators, which are especially important right now. The DPRK so far is not reporting any cases of COVID-19. They have received some testing capacity from China and Russia, but the entire country only has 50 ventilators, and part of their inability to source more from the outside world is, well, not part of, but the entire reason is because of US sanctions. This also includes any kind of heavy machinery that can be used in industrial production. It includes all vehicles, which, both includes like, everyday vehicles like you or I might drive, or like things that are really important for like food production, like say tractors. All manner of agricultural equipment is banned, most of it relating to the metal detail. And, a good example of this is irrigation equipment, which is, again, really important for, having sustainable and sufficient food production for a country. Water treatment equipment is also effectively banned. When we looked at the sector-based sanctions, there are caps on fossil fuel imports into the DPRK. The DPRK is a fossil fuel economy, just like most of the world. So, what this means is that people's ability to get oil, coal, or gas, whether that's to heat their homes with, to drive vehicles with, to produce power with, is very limited. North Korea itself does produce a good amount of coal, but there is a very, very low cap that has been placed on the amount that can be exported. So while some coal trade can occur, there's nothing approaching the volume of total production that the DPRK could be exporting. As I mentioned before, there are blanket bans on exports of minerals, textiles, and agricultural products. And there are also really severe international banking restrictions, which means that the DPRK effectively can't access international capital. They can't get loans. They can't get investment or anything of that nature. The DPRK has actually reached a point where they are actually pushing for the elimination of US sanctions, in part because they are arguing we are in a position where we now, for the first time in our history, are willing to ask for an IMF loan because things are that bad. And you can trust that folks in the DPRK are very aware of just how parasitic the IMF can be. Two other details that many folks don't know about in terms of DPRK sanctions are that there is a blanket global ban on old and new joint ventures with the DPRK. This is instituted through the UN. So what that means is that if a country wants to conduct a joint economic venture with the DPRK, whether that's like, we're going to build a factory together, or, like engage in some sort of trade, that's just totally not allowed. There have also been the UN sanctions have also banned all countries from providing new work permits to DPRK foreign workers, and has actually called for the repatriation of all DPRK foreign workers within 2 years. That order was given in 2017. I haven't been able to find any resources about how effectively that's been enforced since then, but that is more or less a call to deport every North Korean person around the world who is working under a temporary foreign work visa of some kind. So stepping away a bit from the what of sanctions, I want to talk a little bit about the how and the specifics of how they work. And I think it would be really important to think about that from kind of how sanctions are narrativized, or how the story of sanctions is told. There are a lot of cases where, I share this information with people and people are like, oh, well, how come I haven't heard anything about this before? Or I thought that, the sanctions were in response to this or that issue. And that has a lot to do with how sanctions are talked about, and they're often framed as responses to human rights or international security concerns. And that goes beyond just like what appears in media. This is really actually baked into the process of how the US creates sanctions in and of itself. Two examples of this are the annual US Trafficking in Persons report. Every year, a congressional study is published that basically reviews human trafficking around the world. The studies are conducted entirely by the US government. They're the ones who create their own criteria, their own categories, like source their own information, et cetera, et cetera. And it usually ends up very conveniently aligning its allies as, like not in violation of trafficking concerns, and countries that it deems to be enemies as in violation of human trafficking concerns. And this is one way that the human rights rhetoric and the implementation of sanctions is actually formalized within the US government. And effectively in this report, they assign every country to a tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3. If you're in tier 2 or tier 3, then that means that you are found likely to be in violation of some kind of protocol that the US government deems necessary for human rights, for stopping human trafficking. And then you are automatically subject to particular kinds of sanctions as a result of that. So a good number of the countries on the list of 39 are, in tier 2 or tier 3. And while I can't speak to the specifics of whether those are the only sanctions that they're under, it's just an example of how this mechanism operates to create new sanctions. Another example of this is the State Department list of supporters of state-sanctioned terrorism. This is a list that the State Department keeps of countries that it deems basically terrorism sponsors. The DPRK is on this list, Iran is on this list, I believe Venezuela is on the list, and possibly Cuba as well. And this is just another way where, you know, the US government, not even through its legislative branch, but just through like a bureaucracy within the executive branch, can just put a country on the list and instantly initiate particular kinds of sanctions against that country. Now, there's a lot of rhetoric that's placed out there around human rights, democracy, international security. But when we really break down like what countries in the world are doing what, and you know, who the US is actually sanctioning, there's a very clear case to be made that sanctions are really just about the US's geopolitical interests. None of the excuse me, none of the US's allies are ever placed under sanctions, even if they are, you know, possessors of nuclear weapons, even if they are engaging in egregious human rights abuses against their populations. The US itself is not a signatory to most nuclear non-proliferation treaties. So that means that it hasn't actually committed to any sort of international agreements to stopping the production or the spread of nuclear weapons, and yet they are implementing sanctions against countries on the basis of nuclear security threats. An example of how the US also leverages sanctions to get other governments to comply with its political line is the example of Sudan. As many people are aware, Sudan last year saw really enormous uprisings against the Bashar al-Assad government, which is the same government that was responsible for genocide in Darfur. And you know, in spite of all of these things, Sudan has actually been taken off the list of US sanctioned countries. And the reason for that is because in 2018 or 2019, they agreed to cut off all diplomatic ties with the DPRK. So in exchange for that, they were given an exemption from all of the sanctions that they were previously under, which you know, were implemented in the name of human rights concerns, but were withdrawn, not because those human rights concerns disappeared, but because Sudan became more aligned with the US's agenda. Last but not least, the US government itself is very vocal about the fact that sanctions are an alternative to conventional warfare. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin has stated this. A couple of days ago, there was an Office of Foreign Assets Control roundtable that was hosted online where one official stated sanctions are warfare in one sentence, and then later said, you know, that they are an alternative to economic warfare, to conventional warfare, sorry. All of that to say, the officials creating and implementing and defending these sanctions are very aware and see them very much as coercive implements. And even if, you know, they're floated as a softer or more diplomatic way to impose US will abroad, that's still fundamentally what they're for, and it's important that we understand that. One other thing I want to get into is how it is exactly that US sanctions end up being enforced around the world. You may have heard me a couple times in this presentation say that the DPRK or Iran can't access any international capital at all. And you may have been sitting there wondering, well, why is that the case? You know, like, it's not like every bank in the world trades exclusively through the US, or every bank in the world is just an American bank, right? There are all kinds of national banks and all kinds of different kinds of financial institutions all around the world. And the reason that's the case is because of something called dollar hegemony. And what I mean by that is that the US dollar is the international trade and reserve currency for the entire planet. And what that means is that virtually every financial institution on earth, every national bank, every national like equivalent of the Federal Reserve, keeps US dollars on reserve and trades in US dollars when it conducts an international currency, because that's the currency that's accepted. Because of this, there are many, many countries whose currency value is directly tied to the US dollar. Like they basically have it written that it will always be, you know, equal to some proportion of US dollars, or it's effectively bound up to the value of the US dollar because of the way that the market works. So that's kind of getting back into what our hosts were talking about earlier about the various features of the imperialist system. In contemporary imperialism, a lot of how US imperialism works is through its monopolization of the global financial system, which it is established in large part through the fact that the dollar is the singular currency used by the entire world. What this also leads to is banking and finance dominance. Most financial institutions, regardless of where they're based, use dollar-based transactions or have direct trade with US entities. That means that they're effectively subject to US laws and regulations. And the US is able to do that because it exerts jurisdiction and influence over some of the key infrastructure that comprises the international banking system, particularly CHIPS and SWIFT. Those are basically two entities that facilitate the transaction of international trade on a daily basis. They form the kind of communicative network that allows for that trade to occur. CHIPS is based in the US, and so is, like legally under US jurisdiction, and SWIFT has many, I think a majority of US firms on its board of governors. So the US is effectively able to control those systems as well. And so, any bank or financial institution that wants to, any bank or financial institution in the world can basically be punished by the US for violating US laws. An example of this is HSBC, which back in, I want to say 2012, 2013, ended up paying, I'm forgetting the exact number now, but it was in the several tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars in penalties to the US government because they had violated sanctions with, I believe, Sudan, Cuba, and I think Myanmar. And HSBC is not a US bank, right? They are based in the EU, but they are still subject to US laws, still have to pay penalties to the US government because of the fact, they conduct trade in the United States, they conduct trade in US dollars, they use US controlled international banking infrastructure to conduct their business. And so they are pretty much at the mercy of the US government as well. Another mechanism that leads into this is secondary sanctions, and that's what kind of what I mean when I keep referring to the US's ability to exert jurisdiction or punish any entity that violates its sanctions around the world. Secondary sanctions are written into sanctions themselves and basically are additional penalties that are placed onto violators of existing sanctions. So if I am a firm in Belgium and I conduct trade with Iran, I can have secondary sanctions placed against me by the US government, which means that now basically like none of my clients, none of my partners can conduct trade with me because I have violated the US sanctions and also been sanctioned myself. And that leads to how the US is basically able to coerce international cooperation for its sanctions. It does it through the financial architecture, which I have kind of laid out in the previous three factors, but it also leverages its position in institutions like the UN and NATO and other similar bodies to get countries to comply. In the case of the DPRK, a lot of the most stringent sanctions against the DPRK have actually been funneled through the UN Security Council, which again, the US has a veto vote and a permanent seat on. And because these sanctions were implemented through the UN Security Council, that's actually forced many countries to comply with these sanctions that maybe normally would not have or would have found ways to work around them. An example of this is the People's Republic of China, which basically copied and pasted the sanctions that were implemented by the UN and passed their own laws for it, not because there was like a particular desire, to go along, but simply because, as member states of the UN, if they want to continue participating in that body, they need to play by its rules. Venezuela is also an example where the US has leveraged its relationships within NATO and the EU in order to get other countries to comply with its sanctions and basically increase the amount of pressure that's placed on them. A case where this diverges a bit is with Iran, right? Many of the same countries in the EU that are sanctioning Venezuela are not sanctioning Iran presently. And that's because there's a bit of a disagreement between the US and the EU in terms of this latest round of sanctions, since the Iran nuclear deal had already been signed to the satisfaction of the US and EU governments at the time, and it was just this new administration that decided to step out of that. What this all leads to as well within the world of finance and private business and corporations, et cetera, is something called overcompliance. And overcompliance is basically what happens when sanctions are so complex and the consequences for breaking them are so severe that many firms just decide to avoid doing any kind of business altogether with sanctioned countries, even if some of that business would be legal. And the reason for that is that it's just a risk management strategy. These firms are very aware that like they don't have the power to fight the Federal Reserve. They know that they don't have that, you know, it's that they know that whatever they could gain from those business transactions would not be worth the cost of then dealing with the US government after the fact. So this is kind of a very quick overview of how this is actually enacted on a global scale. Last but not least, I want to kind of wrap this up by talking a bit about what's at stake here when we talk about fighting sanctions. I think first and foremost is international health and development / the well-being of people around the world. As I said, 39 countries, 2 billion people, that's about a third of the global population. We can see in the impact sanctions have had in Venezuela, Iran, and the DPRK presently, in Cuba historically, in Iraq, in Haiti, in Zimbabwe, and places all around the world, that, you know, sanctions have a very clear detrimental health effect on the health of local peoples and the economic development of targeted countries, which means that people's quality of life is being affected and their life chances are being diminished. So that's really the first thing that's at stake, right? The lives of millions and millions of people. Secondly, another thing that's at stake is really the financial structure that of the imperialist system itself. And sanctions really only have the impact they do because of finance oligarchy and dollar hegemony. So as we're fighting against sanctions, it's important, I think, to like be explicitly anti-imperialist about it, because you know, it's not that we shouldn't be concerned with people's lives or people's health or people's ability to provide for their loved ones and their communities, but also, you know, like this is the entire reason this is able to occur is because of the structure of the imperialist system, and we need to name that in order to get people to understand that what's at stake here is not just changing a few laws, but actually changing the entire system and reordering the structure of global governance that imperialism has produced. Last but not least, sanctions are an exercise of imperial sovereignty. And what I mean by that is that this is a way for them to govern extraterritorially through the financial system, both to repress geopolitical enemies and to discipline allies. And I think a great example of that is kind of going back to the Korean case. Korea has been in a state of war since 1950, has been divided since 1945, which occurred without the consent of the Korean people. And efforts towards peace and reunification have waxed and waned with various administrations that have been in power in the South. There is currently an administration that is very amenable to reunification and the signing of a peace treaty in the form of Moon Jae-in's government, even though that administration is more friendly towards peace talks and reunification negotiations than before. Any efforts to move that along through economic cooperation or things of that nature is blocked because of US sanctions, and because no matter what the president of South Korea may personally feel about reunification, his administration still has an obligation to uphold US sanctions, because if they don't, it would devastate the South Korean economy, and you know, they would have the lives of millions and millions of people on their hands, right? And I think it's really important for us to grasp that so that we can understand how the US basically takes independence away from not only from countries around the world, and not just the ones that are under sanctions, through these economic implements. And thank you very much. That was my very long presentation. I hope I did not go for too long or go too quickly. I'm not totally sure who's up next.
Oh, it's okay. I can introduce. Thank you so much, Joo-hyun. That was for your very, very clear and knowledgeable overview of sanctions. ILPS is an endorser of the sanctions kill campaign that they mentioned, and we urge everyone to sign on at sanctionskill.org. Joo-hyun will also have an article out soon, right, on this very topic. So we would love to share it once it's out. So yes, please continue to share your thoughts and questions in the chat. We will introduce our last featured speaker, Chris Hilo. Chris Hilo is in Gabriela, New York. They are a nurse in New York Presbyterian Brooklyn Methodist Hospital, and she will be presenting on the struggles of frontline health workers. So welcome, Chris.
Hello, how are you? Hello, everybody. I'm Chris. I am an RN and registered nurse in New York Presbyterian Brooklyn Methodist Hospital in Brooklyn, New York, which is one of the hardest hit boroughs of New York City. Show my ID, I'm real. I'm also part of Gabriela, New York, which is a Filipino women's organization that is anti-imperialist. And our whole thing is organizing, especially around our migrant Filipino women. So I'm just gonna go ahead. I think everybody kind of, thank you so much to Nadia and Joo-hyun before me, who talked about all the things that are going on worldwide, because that also just brings it into context of like what COVID-19 has been able to do to people throughout the world. Before COVID-19, it was, these are horrible experiences that are happening worldwide. And with COVID, it just adds it to exponentially. It's crazy, okay? So I'm just gonna share my screen. Okay, and say, hold on 1 second. Yeah, boy, I know how to do this. Okay, got it. Everybody see this? Hope you do. I made it past 2 hours. All right, this is about frontline workers here in New York City. All right, so let's break this down by cases. What's going on? 129,000 cases for New York City, 34,000 are hospitalized. Confirmed deaths and possible deaths come to a total of 13,230. Possible deaths because these are the cases of people that probably have not been tested. So this is how intense New York City is. You know, New York City in general runs after countries in the amount of cases, okay? So this is a pie chart of basically what's going on in the boroughs. Brooklyn, 26%, Bronx, 22%, and Queens, 31%. These boroughs that have been impacted are also predominantly immigrant, Black and brown people, working class people. These are the people that are going into Manhattan for the past month. These are the people that have been most impacted by COVID-19. Okay, and this is the borough map. If you see that the purple areas, those are the areas with the highest concentration of cases. So especially in Queens, this area right here, if you see my mouse, this is Corona, Elmhurst, Jackson Heights area. Elmhurst Hospital, which is a public hospital, has been greatly impacted by COVID-19. This is a lot of where the organizing happens around, especially in the Filipino community here. Also where I work has been very much a lot of the cases of Central Brooklyn that we are facing, Flatbush, Borough Park, Sunset Park. And also you have to think about Black and brown communities. The only thing that I see on a lot of these people's histories is the fact that they have diabetes, okay? That's it. If you got diabetes, that is definitely a risk factor. So anyways, these areas that have been impacted, and the Bronx, predominantly Black, brown, Latinx communities that have been impacted in New York City, okay? So at the front lines, let's do this. Front lines, meaning to say, not at war. Obviously, I'm in the front lines in the hospital. As you can see, this woman's gear in this picture is just goggles and an N95 and a gown. That's it. So what's going on, especially for healthcare workers? All right, so one of the main issues that we have as healthcare workers is just a lack of PPE. All right, check it out. China got everything. Italy now, everything. Us in the US, we are not safe at all. Even if we wear this gown, we're not safe. And you see that this person also here in the US is wearing just a surgical mask. I'm going to explain why it's so important to understand this lack of PPE, okay? The guidelines, the CDC, the Center of Disease Control, CDC has been lacking, has been so lax. Before, when we would do huddles at our hospital, basically everything would be airborne, airborne, airborne. You have to wear your N95s, you have to wear your surgical masks, you have to wear your gowns, you have to wear everything. Okay, now you see a lax, you see guidelines everything just being taken away, like day by day. This is March 10, and basically say, oh, there's a shortage. All you have to do is wear surgical masks and you're gonna be okay. No, you're not gonna be okay, especially when there's COVID-19 and CDC, World Health Organization are putting out statements of, oh, it's contact, but if you're doing anything like an intubation, yeah, it's airborne. Okay, when somebody coughs on you, that droplet, it's in the air. It's airborne, okay? So you see a lack of, and it's very confusing. It was very confusing in the hospital through this past month. They're saying contact, airborne, droplet, okay? Everything is just so lax. And so you even see here, March 12, you even see them saying airborne precautions. Okay, March 12, 5 days later, if it comes to worse and you don't have any type of PPE, what are you gonna wear to work, says the CDC? Bandanas, bandanas, okay? That is ridiculous. And now I just wanna show here, what is the risk of people of getting sick, okay? The risk of getting sick, especially if you're at a procedure, right? The risk score is 500, okay? And if you're working in an ED or ICU or a med-surg unit with COVID patients, 100, okay? So everything that we're dealing with, like we as people who are on the front line and healthcare workers, we are the ones that are most at risk of getting COVID-19 because we are there during the intubations. We are there suctioning the patient. We are there especially, and a lot of people don't know this, is the fact that COVID-19 also, you can get it via fecal matter. So when I'm cleaning patients, I'm also at risk, okay? So this is me and my N95 and my paper bag. So right now, even today, at least we get one N95 for a day, okay? Before it used to be N95 until it gets soiled. So people would be wearing their N95s for multiple days. And this is actually completely incorrect. Like this is actually not protecting us because once you wear an N95 throughout the whole entire day, it loses its, like it doesn't filter properly. And before, when we would work, if we would wear a whole N95 for the whole entire day, we would probably get written up for this type of behavior. So what have nurses, what have people at the front lines been doing? They have been protesting. There have been protests in the Bronx, at Jacoby, at Harlem Hospital, Kingsbrook. There have been plenty of protests fighting because this is unsafe. This picture was actually of a protest recently at Kingsbrook Hospital. One of my friends works here, and they're only given one isolation gown for a whole entire shift, okay? This is ridiculous. And what is the impact of all of this lack of PPE? People are dying. These are just some of the nurses that we know. This is New York State Nurses Association. Some of the nurses that have actually died in New York, okay? Yao Asante, Susan Susgundo, Aliama John, Frida Okran, Teresa Lococo, and Caius Kelly, who was one of the first ones that we heard about that actually had died from Mount Sinai. But I want to go to this one here, is the fact that when we have such a lack of protective equipment, you will see an increase of health workers getting sick. This is a recent article of over 9,000 US health workers getting sick. And I don't even think this is the proper information because there's nothing actually really tracking how many of our workers getting sick. The reality is that workers are getting sick, not just nurses, not just doctors, environmental staff is getting sick, our techs, nurse techs are getting sick. A lot of people are getting sick. Now, what does that mean for the actual hospital? And what does that mean for us? When our staff is getting sick, that means our staffing ratios we have more patients. What does that mean for our patients with COVID? My floor is completely COVID. So that means instead of just taking care of maybe 6 to 7 COVID patients, you have 9 to 10 COVID patients a shift. So what does that mean? That means that it's actually unsafe for our patients when we're dealing with this. And we have actually gotten some traveler nurses, not just for my hospital, I've heard throughout different hospitals across the city. But the reality is like, they're also putting their lives at risk because our PPE has not increased. Like the only thing that we were able to change, oh shoot, sorry, but here, New York State Nurses Association, the fact that we had to put pressure on our local New York government for the New York State COVID task force, basically we have to demand that we at least get one N95 once a day. And it's not guaranteed, but at least we have this as a way to hold any type of management accountable, saying that according to the New York State COVID task force, we have to have this. All right, bring it back. All right. So how does it all, what is this? How does it all connect to imperialism? Well, the fact that look at our budget. Look at our budget of discretionary spending in Trump's administration. 57% is going to defense, and that's going to overseas military. That's the money that we're talking about that's going to impact Palestinians, because that's the funds that are going to Israel, okay? Those are the funds that is hurting millions of people around the world. But for us here in the United States, right? Like, how much is actually going to health? 7%, 90 billion. Education, 62 billion, 5%. We are getting the scraps, okay? We are getting the scraps, and it's been way too long. Like, this needs to change. We can't allow a government that is going to continue to take our tax dollars, your tax dollars, and basically use it for killing people in other countries. Let's be real. And human rights violations. And even this, Homeland Security, take that out too. all this money for ICE and deportations. Take that out. We don't need that. That's not essential. Oh, and then some people will push back and be like, no, but you got the Navy ship. You got the Navy ship helping you out in New York City. That Navy ship only, that 90% of that Navy ship is empty. Empty. 71 of the USNS Comfort's 500 beds are occupied. And that was as of last Friday, 9:24 p.m. So when people try to tell me that they're helping us and we're getting the resources, that is useless because I know what kind of requirements are needed to be on that ship. And basically, they don't even, it is so hard to get on, to like actually have a patient on that ship because there's so many requirements. So what are we gonna do as people? I just wanted to make it short and sweet. We're not disposable, we are workers, and I want everybody to organize, 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 get organized, join ILPS because this is what we're at. This is a society that needs to change. And look, I made this for you guys. In celebration of Lenin, there are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where a decade happens. COVID-19, okay? How many times has this ever happened before in your lifetime? So many nurses that I work with, this has never happened. Now, this is a time where we have to change, and everybody wants everything back to normal or back to the status quo. The status quo never worked for us and isn't working for us. So we need to do something about it. I'm gonna keep on fighting. I have work tomorrow. I got 3 shifts at the end of this week. I will keep on fighting over here, and I make sure that I am protected as much as possible, but I also know I'm risking it. Nina?
Word. Thank you, Chris. Thanks for the agitating presentation. So now it's time for the last Q&A. So Andrew, take it away.
Yes, so we have a lot of good questions in the chat, and you know, we only have a certain amount of time, so I apologize if we didn't get to your question. It's not because it wasn't a lesser quality question, it's just the nature of the beast with trying to, you know, run everything on time. The first question, and I know Cody wanted to answer this one, but you know, of course, any of the panelists are welcome. How do you see the fight between the US and China on COVID-19? And is it the contradiction you mentioned under the contradiction between the imperialist powers?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. And really thank you so much to all of the featured speakers and really driving home how all of these aspects of imperialism come to light in our struggles of how people are resisting. Thank you. I think the question that Andrew just posed, that was posed earlier, I want to say that the primary contradiction of the COVID crisis is not the US versus China. It is the monopoly bourgeoisie ruling class against the working class and oppressed peoples of the world. And it is the imperialist nations, with the US as the primary imperialist nation, against the colonial and semi-colonial nations of the world. And I think this is something that we as anti-imperialists need to remember as our primary form of unity, is seeing how the monopoly bourgeoisie utilize the states of the imperialist system to really push their agenda and profit off of the death of so many people. I think that in terms of that fourth contradiction between imperialist powers themselves, we really need to keep studying. I think we all need to keep studying the world system as much as we can. As I finish up, I want to drop a link that y'all can read that was written by the ILPS chairperson emeritus, Professor Jose Maria Sison, that really goes into some of the details that I'm just going to name drop real quick. I do think that we need to always study how contradictions change. I think that as states that are or have been socialist or anti-imperialist consolidate power, contradictions will always change amongst them. I think in particular, especially what's pointed out in this essay, is that US investments in Chinese manufacturing and then also the military posturing within the Pacific are two things to look very closely at in terms of China. But really bringing it back to that first point, that the US imperialism is heightening its wars on the people and its role as the #1 enemy of the world in its struggle against other rising powers.
Any other panelists want to answer that question? Okay. I'll move to the second one, which I think is an excellent question from, I forgot to mention the first question came from Wally. So thank you, Wally. This question is from Jofus and Kat. Lenin had also characterized that we are living in the era of imperialism and socialist and proletarian revolution. We focused on the ongoing validity of his theory of imperialism, but can somebody touch upon the prospects of socialist or proletarian revolution?
I mean, I would argue that the prospects have rarely been. I'm not going to try to compare it to history. Clearly, we're in a situation where there is where there's a lot of forces at play, where there is where the contradictions in the world are sharp.
Could you just come closer to the mic, Steph?
Sorry, I put it up to get it out of my face and then forgot to put it down. Yeah, so I was just going to say, I mean, I think that the prospects are probably better than they've been in a very long time. The contradictions are sharpening. U.S. imperialism is continuously in an ever deepening crisis, which we can see in a number of ways, and the forces on the ground continue to strengthen. I mean, obviously, the question of organization and is a prerequisite for the ability to lead such a thing into being. But I think the prospects are excellent.
Any other panelists want to make a stab?
Yeah, I don't want to go too far into it. I think that Steph already answered a lot of it, but I do want to just highlight kind of what was said at the end, which is, socialist and proletarian revolution will not just fall in our laps because imperialism is in crisis, and we need to make sure that we understand the importance of organizing on the ground and building power and building forces of people's organizations. And we really need to step it up because just as imperialism is in crisis and they are fighting to hold on to their power, we need to step up our organizing so that we are also able to pull it down completely.
Awesome, thank you. Any other panelists before I move to, and oh hey, to my co-hosts, how much time do we have for more questions?
We are actually over time, so if you could just go a little faster.
Okay, one more then.
Oh no, we're over time in general, but we can do maybe 5 more minutes for. Okay.
Well, I'll do a narrower question that can be answered concretely. Can someone, and this one's from Anne Marie, can someone kindly explain the connection between imperialism, or maybe particularly US imperialism and Israeli occupation? question probably would have been best for Nadia, but she's off the call.
Hi, this is Chris. I'm gonna try this one. So, explain the connection between IMPE and Israeli occupation. Well, we all live in belly of beast of US imperialism. Okay, you just saw my pie chart where it's 100 or 600 or more, 600 billion that is going to the defense. Now, how much of those tax dollars is going to Israel? Let's look it up. I'm gonna Google it right now. Just so we all have an understanding of concrete information. Okay, US financial aid to Israel. Okay, more than 1.5 billion. Okay. Oh, sorry, that's 2017. The money that is going to Israel, okay, that is where you have to find the connection. $3.8 billion in foreign military aid. I'm gonna put that in the chat, all right? Yes, 4 billion per year. That's what was written there. That's the connection. So every time you pay income tax or whatever tax you pay, when they take it from you for your paycheck, that's the money that's going to fund the genocide that is happening in Palestine. That's it.
If I can add a little bit here, I am definitely not an expert in the particular topic of Palestine, but I do think that two other additional areas of overlap is the degree of military and security collaboration between Israel and the United States. There are Israeli companies and contractors who work on the construction of the southern border with Mexico. There are joint trainings and skill swaps and weapon sales and all kinds of different connections between like the official policing apparatuses of the two countries and the official militaries of the two countries, as well as various private entities and companies that, you know, like are part of that larger complex. So I think that's also another place where there's definite overlap and real relationship.
And the last thing that I'll put on there as well is Nadia made a really solid point about talking about the control of Palestinian laborers within the 48 territories, and specifically how the control of labor allows the economic division of the world, that fourth feature, to continue. I think that's another strong element for us to remember, is how the military occupation of Palestine allows for monopoly corporations to keep their power consolidated.
Awesome, thank you everyone. And actually, we're gonna squeeze in one more question. And I think it's probably good for Joo Hyun to answer. Can other countries impose sanctions and do they get the same enforcement?
And that's pretty straightforward, I guess. The first part is yes. Sanction is, you know, it's any measure that can be taken by any government. In the case of the UN, you know, like the UN isn't even a country, right? It's just an organization. Like they're able to implement sanctions. The second part, it really depends on who you are. You know, like there are, if you are one of the imperialist nations or allied nations, then your sanctions have a much stronger chance of actually having some kind of impact. If you are a colonized or semi-colonized nation, then you know, depending on the exact nature of your relationship with imperialist countries and systems, your sanctions may only be enforceable by you, in which case, you know, there's tons of other countries in the world, and it's very rare that those would end up having like a really meaningful, tangible impact.
Thank you so much. And I'll throw it back to my co-hosts to close us out.
Great, thank you. So just to close us out, we just have a few announcements and calls to action. Again, sorry that we didn't have as much time for the discussion portion, but please stay in touch, and Cody will walk through how we can, you know, stay involved. Thank you, Cody.
Thank you, Nina, and thank you to all my comrades who have really given us already solid calls to action. I think there was an ask in one of the chats if we could maybe compile a lot of the links. We've seen a lot of great links being posted here. So I do think that our ILPS US Steering Committee will collect those and send them out in a follow-up email. But really quick, a few more to drop here for these 4 calls to action. So the first is join ILPS. We're the largest international anti-imperialist United Front alliance, and we're growing every month. We just had our 6th International Assembly this past year in Hong Kong, and we have a lot of work to do in strengthening this work around the world, but also in the US. The link was dropped earlier, but I will quickly drop if you want to apply your organization now. Please fill out this form and our ILPS membership committee will get in touch with you. We're even thinking of the possibility of holding online membership orientations. So please stay in touch that way. The second one is we have April 15th was the ILPS Global Day of Action for People's Health. And us in the US, we created a social media campaign of which you could print out a picture and say why you support people's health and take a picture and put it on your social media. Our US chapter is extending this campaign up until May Day. We want to compile as many recordings, either pictures or videos of people saying why they support people's health, and particularly frontline workers. So if you are a frontline worker, or if you know other allies, other of your coworkers to send this to, please do that. Because we want to collect a compilation to come out on May Day so that our ILPS country chapter can continue to unite our organizing with workers' movements in this time. We also are very excited to announce that ILPS US is preparing for our first ever solidarity delegation to Palestine. We do not have a date for when this will be, but we are starting to take interest. So please fill out this interest form that I just dropped in the chat and will also come out with on a follow-up email. And this will just be an initial interest so we can start talking to people and start figuring out when that delegation could be, whether it's early 2021 or another time. And then finally, ILPS is a member of the coalition to march on the Democratic National Convention. I'm dropping a link, my final link in the chat to the coalition's website. The DNC has been moved to August as of now. We don't know yet if it will be in person or a webinar convention, which would be quite the thing. But one way or another, the coalition is still planning to march and engage in any way against this. Because what ILPS is really calling for the DNC is we don't want another Democratic Party platform that will not speak in order to keep the capitalist system going. We want to call for a truly people's platform that comes outside of the Democratic and Republican parties that are subservient to the monopoly bourgeoisie. We're looking to create a people's platform and present it inside events alongside the International Migrants Alliance for the DNC. So we want to make sure that people stay tuned. We'll come out with more information as the conditions are changing around that. But we will have a people's platform event around the DNC. And that kind of concludes all the main calls to action that we have as an ILPS US country chapter. So I guess to finish it up, Chris, you really brought us home with that quote from Lenin. There are decades, there are decades when weeks, weeks happen, but then there are weeks that decades happen. And I think that really brings home the true conditions that we are in right and that we are seeing a crisis rise up. Thank you. There are decades when nothing happens, and then there are weeks where decades happen. In this crisis, where people are dying every single day, we are hearing more than I have heard in my lifetime, more and more workers calling for workers' control of production, calling for, but along with the calls for mass testing, for PPE for all workers, for moratoriums and freezes on rent. We are hearing for people actually calling to unite our organizing even stronger. We know that when this COVID crisis is over, there will be years of an economic crisis to follow. So I really hope that each one of you who is here and joined us today, if you are not a member of the League, please apply your organization's membership, because we have a lot of work to do. And as the crisis of neoliberal imperialism exacerbates, let's continue to take advantage of the cracks in the imperialist system. And let's fight for a world that all of us can be proud of. Let's truly fight for a socialist humanity, future for humanity. So thank you everyone for logging on. Please stay in touch, and long live international solidarity.
Thank you, everyone.